Hello, family. Welcome to our channel where we bring you exciting story. Please subscribe to this channel because it means so much to us. Kindly like, comment, and don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss any of our story. Note, you can click on the CC icon on the screen if the subtitle is not showing. Sit back and enjoy. I've been a paramedic for 12 years, seen it all, from car wrecks to heart attacks, even delivered a baby once on the side of the highway. But nothing prepared me for what happened at Orchard Pine Estates. A 76-year-old woman, Jeanette Williams, was dying of a heart attack, and I was yards away from saving her, until an HOA guard tasered me for trespassing. She didn't make it, and now the whole board is being sued for wrongful death. This is HOA Karen Files, where we expose the rules that hurt more than they help. If you've got a story about an HOA gone wrong, drop it in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell for more. Let's get into how a quiet neighborhood turned into a battlefield for bureaucracy. The morning started like any other for Meredith Evans, a 38-year-old paramedic with a no-nonsense attitude and a knack for staying calm under pressure. She'd been on the job for over a decade, working out of County General's EMS station in a mid-sized suburban town just outside Atlanta. Her shift had already been a long one, 12 hours of back-to-back calls, from a kid with a broken arm to an elderly man who'd fallen down his stairs. She was sipping lukewarm coffee in the ambulance bay, joking with her partner Kyle about how they'd earned a quiet end to the shift, when the radio crackled to life. Unit 14, we've got a 911 at Orchard Pine Estates, Unit 117. Female, 76, possible cardiac arrest. Caller reports she's turning blue, priority 1. Meredith's stomach tightened. Cardiac arrests were a race against time. Every second mattered. She and Kyle grabbed their gear, jumped into the ambulance, and peeled out of the bay, sirens blaring. Orchard Pine Estates was a gated community about 10 minutes away, known for its pristine lawns, retirees walking their dogs, and an HOA that seemed to care more about mailbox colors than anything else. Meredith had been there before for minor calls, usually elderly folks with chest pain or falls, but she'd never had trouble getting in. Until today, the ambulance screeched to a stop at the community's stone gate, a regal structure with a sign that read Orchard Pine Estates, a secure haven. Kyle punched the call button at the gate, expecting it to swing open as it had in the past. Nothing. He hit it again, harder. EMS, we've got a cardiac arrest. Open the gate now. A voice crackled through the speaker, gruff and unyielding. State your clearance code. Kyle blinked, then looked at Meredith. Clearance code? We're paramedics. Open the damn gate. The voice came back, colder this time. No code, no entry. HOA rules. Meredith didn't wait. She grabbed her med bag, slung it over her shoulder, and jumped out of the ambulance. I'm going in on foot. Call the watch commander for access. Kyle nodded, already on the radio, as Meredith sprinted toward the pedestrian gate a few yards away. She could see Unit 117 just beyond the gate, a tidy two-story house with a black ribbon on the mailbox, a detail she'd later learn was a leftover from a previous family loss. Her heart pounded, not from the run, but from the ticking clock in her head. A cardiac arrest patient had a 10% chance of survival if CPR wasn't started within 4 minutes. They were already at minute 3. She reached the pedestrian gate, a metal contraption with a keypad and a scanner. A man stood on the other side, mid-40s, stocky, wearing a black vest with HOA security in bold white letters. His name tag read Brad Morton. He held a taser in one hand, the other resting on a walkie-talkie clipped to his belt. Meredith flashed her EMS badge, her voice urgent but professional. I'm a paramedic. There's a heart attack patient in Unit 117. Let me through now. Brad's face didn't budge. He looked at her badge, then at her uniform, the bright red paramedic patch on her sleeve, and finally at the ambulance parked behind her, lights flashing. You don't have clearance, he said, his voice flat, like he was reading from a script. No one enters without a gate code or an entry pass. Meredith's jaw dropped. Are you serious? There's a woman dying in there. I don't have time for this. Call your supervisor, or let me through. Brad stepped closer, his hand tightening on the taser. I'm the supervisor on duty. No pass, no entry. Call your own supervisor if you've got a problem. Meredith pointed to her ID again, her voice rising. I'm EMS. This is a life-or-death emergency. Move, or I'm coming through. Before she could take another step, Brad raised the taser, aimed it at her torso, and fired. The crackle of electricity sliced through the morning air, a sound that would haunt Meredith for months. The voltage tore through her, sending her to her knees on the manicured grass just outside the gate. Her med bag hit the ground, spilling bandages and a stethoscope. Her body convulsed, her lungs gasping for air as involuntary tears welled in her eyes. She tried to speak, to scream, but all that came out was a choked gasp. Brad stood over her, taser still in hand, his face a mix of defiance and uncertainty. "You were warned," he muttered, as if that justified everything. Inside Unit 117, Jeanette Williams, 76, lay on her living room floor, her husband Gary kneeling beside her, his hands shaking as he tried to remember CPR from a class he'd taken years ago. "Stay with me, Jeanette," he whispered, his voice breaking. "They're coming, I promise." But they weren't. Jeanette's lips were blue, her chest still. She'd been complaining of chest pain for days, but that morning it had hit like a freight train. Gary had called 911 the moment she collapsed, his voice frantic as he begged for help. Now, as the minutes ticked by, he could hear the ambulance siren outside, but no one was coming through the door. Kyle, still in the ambulance, finally got through to the watch commander, who promised to override the gate system. But it was too late. By the time the gate creaked open and Kyle sprinted to Meredith's side, dragging her to her feet, Jeanette's heart had stopped for good. They reached the house 8 minutes after the 911 call, double the critical window for survival. Meredith, still shaking from the taser shock, pushed through the pain to start CPR, but she knew it was futile. Jeanette was gone. The county medical examiner arrived 20 minutes later, pronouncing her dead at the scene and zipping her into a black bag as Gary sobbed in the corner. Word spread through Orchard Pine Estates like wildfire. This was a neighborhood where disputes usually centered on petty things, someone's Christmas lights being too bright, or a mailbox painted the wrong shade of beige. Now, a woman was dead because a paramedic had been tasered for trying to save her. Neighbors gathered on their porches, whispering in disbelief. A grainy cell phone video from a resident's porch camera surfaced online, showing the confrontation, Meredith's desperate pleas, Brad's stony refusal, and the crackle of the taser. The video went viral within hours, racking up thousands of views and comments like, "This is insane," and "HOA needs to be shut down." Brad Morton, the guard, told investigators he was just following protocol. "We've had break-ins before," he said, his voice defensive. "I was protecting the homeowner's safety, but the community wasn't buying it. How could a uniformed paramedic, with an ambulance parked in plain sight, be mistaken for a threat?" The outrage grew, and soon the local news picked up the story, plastering headlines like "HOA guard tasers paramedic, patient dies" across every channel. The Orchard Pine Estates HOA board, the ones who'd hired Brad and set the strict security rules, found themselves in the crosshairs of a public relations nightmare and a looming lawsuit. Gary Williams, Jeanette's husband of 50 years, was shattered. He sat in his living room that night, staring at a photo of Jeanette from their wedding day, her smile bright, her eyes full of life. They'd moved to Orchard Pine for a quiet retirement, dreaming of morning walks and evenings on the porch. Now, that dream was gone, replaced by a grief so heavy he could barely breathe. But beneath the grief, a fire was building. "They killed her," he whispered to himself. "They killed my Jeanette with their damn rules." By the end of the week, Gary had hired an attorney, Rebecca Stokes, and announced he was suing the entire HOA board for wrongful death. Orchard Pine Estates, once a picture-perfect community, was about to become ground zero for a legal battle that would change it forever. Orchard Pine Estates wasn't always a fortress. 10 years ago, it had been a typical suburban community, retirees walking their dogs, kids riding bikes, neighbors chatting over fences. The HOA existed, but it was mostly a formality, run by volunteers who focused on organizing block parties and reminding people to mow their lawns. That all changed after a string of petty crimes shook the neighborhood. A couple of teens spray-painted the tennis court, a model home was burglarized, and a few mailboxes were smashed in a late-night prank. The incidents were minor, but they spooked the HOA board, especially Alan Connolly, the president. Alan, a 68-year-old retiree with a scar on his jaw from a mugging in his 20s, had always been paranoid about safety. He'd grown up in a rough part of Chicago, where he learned to trust no one. When he moved to Orchard Pine with his wife, he saw it as a sanctuary, a place where he could finally let his guard down. But the petty crimes brought back old fears, and he pushed the board to take drastic action. They replaced the volunteer security team with a private contractor, installed gates with scanners, set up cameras on every corner, and hired uniformed guards to patrol the streets. HOA fees skyrocketed to cover the costs, jumping from $200 a year to $800. Residents grumbled, but most bought into the narrative. This was about safety, about keeping the bad elements out. The new security measures turned Orchard Pine into a gated fortress. Every visitor had to scan a code or get clearance from the guardhouse. Even delivery drivers had to wait for approval, often leaving packages at the gate when the process took too long. Residents were issued key fobs, and anyone without one, like a friend dropping by unannounced, was turned away. The board justified it all with buzzwords like community standards and property values. Allen gave speeches at HOA meetings, his voice firm. "We're not just protecting our homes. We're protecting our way of life." Most residents nodded along, even as they rolled their eyes at the inconvenience. They didn't realize how far the rules would go until it was too late. Brad Morton was the perfect soldier for this new regime. A former mall cop with a chip on his shoulder, he'd been hired by the security contractor for his dedication to protocol. At 45, Brad had never seen real action, but he carried himself like a soldier, his vest always pressed, his taser always charged. He took the HOA's rules as gospel, treating every visitor like a potential threat. To him, the gate was a battle line, and he was the first line of defense. He'd once bragged to a coworker about turning away a pizza delivery guy because he didn't have a resident's name on the order. "Rules are rules," he'd said, smirking. That mindset made him the worst possible person to be on duty the morning Meredith arrived. The day after Jeanette's death, the community was in chaos. Neighbors gathered in small groups, whispering about the video that was now all over the internet. Some defended Brad, saying he was just doing his job. "We've had break-ins," one resident, a 70-year-old named Clara, said to her neighbor over coffee. Maybe he thought she was a fake, but most were horrified. "A fake paramedic?" Another neighbor, a retired teacher named Tom, shot back. "With an ambulance right there? Come on, Clara, that's ridiculous." The divide grew as the day went on, with some residents blaming Brad and others pointing fingers at the board for creating such a rigid system. Meredith, meanwhile, was at County General, her arm in a sling from the taser's impact. The voltage had caused nerve damage, leaving her with a burning pain that flared every time she moved her shoulder. She sat in the ambulance bay, staring at her bandaged arm, replaying the moment in her head. She could still see Brad's eyes, wide, unyielding, like he truly believed he was in the right. She'd been a paramedic for 12 years, had saved countless lives, and now she was sidelined because of a power-tripping guard. Her supervisor had put her on light duty, but she was itching to get back in the field. "I can't let this stop me," she told Kyle, her voice firm despite the pain. "I won't let him win." Kyle felt his own guilt eating at him. He'd been stuck in the ambulance, on the radio with the watch commander, while Meredith was tasered. He kept replaying the moment he ran to her side, seeing her crumpled on the grass, her med bag spilled out like a crime scene. "I should have been with you," he said, his voice low. "We should have just rammed the gate." Meredith shook her head. "You did what you were supposed to do. This isn't on you, it's on them." They decided to visit Gary Williams that evening, to pay their respects and offer any support they could. Gary welcomed them with a handshake, his eyes red from crying. "She was my everything," he said, his voice breaking. 50 years, and they took her from me over a damn gate code." Gary's grief was raw, but it was hardening into something else, resolve. He showed Meredith and Kyle a box of old HOA letters he'd kept over the years, notices about fee hikes, memos about the new security protocols, even a warning he'd gotten for leaving his trash can out too long. "Jeanette always said we gave them too much power," he said, his voice steady now. She was right. He'd already hired Rebecca Stokes, a sharp attorney known for taking on big cases with a mix of empathy and tenacity. Rebecca had a reputation for winning wrongful death suits, and she saw Gary's case as a slam dunk. "This isn't just about one guard," she told Gary. "It's about a system that values rules over lives." We're going after the whole board. The board, meanwhile, was in full damage control mode. They met in their opulent clubhouse, a building with tall windows overlooking pristine tennis courts and a man-made lake. Alan Connolly sat at the head of the table, his jaw tight, the scar on his face twitching as he listened to the other members argue. Some wanted to throw Brad under the bus, calling his actions an isolated incident. Others worried about their own liability. Could they lose their homes if the lawsuit succeeded? We never told him to taser anyone. One member, a retired accountant named Susan, said, her voice shrill. But we hired him. Another member, a former lawyer named Richard, shot back. And we set the rules. This is on us. Outside the clubhouse, reporters had set up camp, their cameras trained on the entrance. Residents walking by were bombarded with questions. Did you know about the security rules? Do you think the board is responsible? Most muttered no comment and hurried away, but the tension was palpable. Orchard Pine Estates, once a symbol of suburban perfection, was now a lightning rod for outrage. And as the sun set on that first day, with Jeanette's death still fresh in everyone's minds, one thing was clear. This was only the beginning. The lawsuit hit the Orchard Pine Estates HOA board like a tidal wave. Gary Williams, with Rebecca Stokes by his side, filed a wrongful death suit naming every board member individually. The complaint was scathing. It accused the board of fostering an environment of militarized vigilance that prioritized protocol over human life, directly leading to Jeanette's death. The suit sought $5 million in damages, plus punitive penalties, to send a message. Rebecca knew the case would resonate with a jury. Jeanette was a beloved grandmother, and Meredith was a heroic paramedic. The board, on the other hand, looked like a group of out-of-touch bureaucrats who'd let their obsession with rules kill someone. The board's first response was to distance themselves from Brad Morton. They issued a statement on the neighborhood's online portal, calling his actions an unfortunate misinterpretation of our security procedures. They suspended Brad with pay, confining him to his condo in the back of the neighborhood, while the police investigated potential criminal charges. But the statement did little to quell the outrage. Residents flooded the portal with comments. You hired him. Those rules are insane. My husband had a stroke last year. What if this happens to us? The board's attempt at damage control only made things worse, as it became clear they were more interested in saving face than taking responsibility. Meredith, still on light duty, spent her days in physical therapy, trying to regain full use of her arm. The taser had left her with lingering nerve pain, a constant reminder of that morning. She'd wake up in the middle of the night, her heart racing, seeing Brad's face in her dreams, the way he'd looked at her, like she was a criminal instead of a first responder. She started seeing a therapist to deal with the trauma, but what kept her going was the thought of getting back in the ambulance. I can't let this define me, she told her therapist, her voice firm. I'm a paramedic. This is who I am. Her supervisor was supportive, but cautious. You'll be back out there soon, he said. But we need to make sure you're ready, physically and mentally. Kyle, meanwhile, was struggling with his own demons. He couldn't shake the guilt of not being there when Meredith was tasered. He'd replayed the moment 1,000 times in his head. What if he'd jumped out of the ambulance sooner? What if they'd ignored the gate and driven straight through? He started working extra shifts, throwing himself into the job to avoid thinking about it. But when he and Meredith were called to give statements for the lawsuit, he knew he couldn't run from it anymore. They sat down with Rebecca Stokes in her office, a small space downtown filled with legal books and photos of her kids. Rebecca was in her late 50s, with graying hair and a sharp gaze that missed nothing. Tell me everything, she said, her pen poised over a legal pad. Don't leave out a single detail. Meredith recounted the morning in vivid detail, the 911 call, the race to Orchard Pine, the confrontation at the gate. She described how she'd shown Brad her badge, pointed to the ambulance, begged him to let her through. I told him we had a cardiac arrest, she said, her voice steady but laced with anger. I told him there was no time for clearance codes. He didn't care. Kyle added his perspective, explaining how he'd been on the radio with the watch commander, trying to get the gate opened. By the time I got to her, she was on the ground, he said, his voice tight. I should have been there sooner. Rebecca listened intently, taking notes, her expression unreadable. When they finished, she leaned back in her chair. This is going to be a strong case, she said. You two are credible witnesses, and the video backs up your story. We're going to make them pay. Back at Orchard Pine, the community was fracturing. The lawsuit had exposed deep cracks in the neighborhood's facade of unity. Some residents rallied behind Gary, starting a petition called Save Our Community that demanded the board's resignation. They went door to door, collecting signatures, their frustration boiling over. "We moved here for peace, not a police state," one resident, a 60-year-old named Linda, said at a community meeting. "If an ambulance can't get through, what's the point of all this security?" Others defended the board, arguing that the rules were there for a reason. "We've had break-ins," a man named Ed, a retired cop, said. "You can't just let anyone in. What if it had been a real threat?" The debate raged on, splitting neighbors who'd once been friends. The board, meanwhile, was falling apart from within. Alan Connolly, the president, was drowning in angry phone calls from residents. "What if it had been my wife?" one caller shouted. "Why did you hire that lunatic?" Alan tried to reassure them. "We're investigating. We want justice too." But his words felt hollow. He knew the truth. The board had created this mess. They'd approved the security measures, hired the contractor, and set the tone of paranoia that Brad had taken to its extreme. At an emergency meeting in the clubhouse, the tension was thick. Susan, the accountant, suggested settling with Gary to avoid a trial. "We can't risk losing everything," she said. Richard, the former lawyer, disagreed. "If we settle, it's an admission of guilt. We fight this." Alan sat silently, his mind racing. He'd built this fortress to feel safe, but now it was crumbling around him. As the lawsuit gained momentum, a new rumor surfaced. The security company might not have been licensed to use tasers. A resident who worked at the county licensing office did some digging and found no record of a permit. The news spread like wildfire, fueling the residents' anger. They armed him with a taser without a license. Linda said at a community gathering, her voice shaking. "What else don't we know?" The board scrambled to verify the claim, but the damage was done. If true, they could face regulatory penalties on top of the lawsuit, a double blow that could bankrupt the HOA. By the end of the week, picket signs had appeared on the manicured lawns of Orchard Pine. HOA reforms now. Paramedics, not paperwork. Justice for Jeanette. The signs were homemade, black Sharpie on white poster board, but their message was clear. Residents who'd once been content to let the board handle everything were now taking a stand. The community was no longer a fortress of serenity. It was a battleground, and the fight was just getting started. The trial began 6 months after Jeanette's death, in a packed courtroom downtown. On one side sat Gary Williams, his attorney Rebecca Stokes, and Meredith Evans, who'd insisted on wearing her paramedic uniform to the proceedings. On the other side were the Orchard Pine Estates HOA board members, dressed in somber suits, flanked by their legal team. A handful of residents had come to watch, though most followed along on live news coverage. The tension in the room was palpable, a mix of grief, anger, and anticipation. Rebecca Stokes opened with a powerful statement, painting a vivid picture of that fateful morning. She described Jeanette's final moments, Gary's desperate 911 call, and Meredith's heroic attempt to save her, only to be stopped by a taser. "This wasn't a random act," Rebecca said, her voice steady. "This was the inevitable result of a system that values rules over lives." The Orchard Pine Estates HOA board created an environment where a paramedic was treated like a criminal and a woman died because of it. The jury, a mix of young professionals and retirees, listened intently, their faces a mix of shock and sympathy. Meredith took the stand first, her voice calm but firm as she recounted the events. She described showing Brad her badge, pointing to the ambulance, begging him to let her through. "I told him we had a cardiac arrest," she said, her eyes meeting the jury's. "I told him there was no time for clearance codes. He tasered me anyway." The jury leaned in, their expressions darkening as she described the pain of the taser, the helplessness of watching Jeanette die. Kyle testified next, his voice tight with emotion as he described finding Meredith on the ground and realizing they were too late to save Jeanette. "We train for these situations," he said. "We know how to save lives. But we can't do that if we're stopped at the gate." Medical experts followed, explaining in clinical terms how critical timing is in a cardiac arrest. With immediate CPR, Mrs. Williams had a 40% chance of survival, one doctor said. By the time the paramedics reached her, that chance was zero. The testimony landed like a hammer blow, driving home the cost of those lost minutes. Then came Brad Morton. He looked smaller on the stand, his uniform replaced by a cheap suit, his voice timid as he tried to explain himself. "I was following protocol," he said, his eyes darting to the board members. "The HOA was strict. No exceptions, even for EMS. I thought I was doing my job." Under cross-examination, Rebecca tore into him. "You saw a uniformed paramedic, an ambulance with lights flashing, and you still thought she was a threat?" Brad stammered. I was just following orders." The phrase hung in the air, a chilling echo of excuses from history. The board members were next, and their testimony did little to help their case. Alan Connolly took the stand, his voice shaky as he tried to defend the security measures. "We had break-ins," he said, his scar twitching. "We wanted to keep our residents safe." Rebecca didn't let him off easy. "Did you ever consider that emergency services might need immediate access?" she asked, her tone sharp. Alan squirmed. "We had a system. Guards were supposed to open the gate after verification. But they didn't," Rebecca shot back. "And you hired someone like Brad Morton, gave him a taser, and told him to enforce your rules without exception. Correct?" Alan's mouth went dry. "We told them to use common sense," he mumbled, but the words sounded hollow. The defense tried to shift blame to Brad, arguing that he'd acted outside their policies. "We never authorized the use of force against EMS," their attorney said. But Rebecca countered with a damning argument. This wasn't a rogue officer. This was the inevitable outcome of a militarized fortress mentality. You created an environment where a paramedic was seen as a threat, and a woman died because of it. She held up a diagram of the community's security protocols, highlighting the layers of bureaucracy, clearance codes, gate scanners, guard verification. "When do the rules become so rigid that they cost a life?" she asked the jury, her voice ringing through the courtroom. The jury deliberated for 2 days, a tense stretch that left everyone on edge. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered, holding signs that read "Justice for Jeanette" and "Paramedics, not paperwork." Finally, on a Tuesday afternoon, the verdict came. The foreperson stood, her voice clear. "We find in favor of the plaintiff, Gary Williams, and rule that the Orchard Pine Estates Homeowners Association is liable for wrongful death through negligence and obstructive security policies." The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. The jury awarded $4 million in damages, a sum that would cripple the HOA financially. Gary closed his eyes, a wave of emotion washing over him. Justice felt bittersweet. He'd never get Jeanette back, but he hoped the verdict would save someone else's loved one. Rebecca placed a hand on his shoulder, a glimmer of triumph in her eyes. The board members sat frozen, their faces pale. This wasn't the minor settlement they'd hoped for. It was a decisive blow, a public statement that their fortress approach had failed. Alan Connolly stared at the floor, his mind racing. He'd built this system to feel safe, but it had cost a life, and now it was costing him everything. The aftermath was swift. Faced with massive financial obligations, the HOA had to consider dissolution or a complete restructuring. The security force was let go, the scanners and guardhouses dismantled. Residents began advocating for a new system, one that prioritized human connection over paranoia. Alan resigned under pressure, and several board members sold their homes and left the community, unable to face the stigma. Those who stayed offered apologies, trying to rebuild trust with their neighbors. But the scars of that day would linger for years. The verdict sent shockwaves through Orchard Pine Estates, but it also sparked a transformation. With the HOA on the brink of financial collapse, residents stepped up to take control. A new board was elected, made up of people like Linda and Tom, who'd been vocal critics of the old regime. Their first act was to overhaul the security system, replacing the fortress-like measures with a streamlined approach. Gates were left open for emergency services, and a direct line to the local fire and EMS stations was established. "No more clearance codes," Linda said at the first meeting, her voice firm. "If an ambulance shows up, they get in, no questions asked." Clara, the 70-year-old who'd initially defended Brad, had a change of heart. She organized a neighborhood watch that worked directly with local law enforcement, focusing on real threats rather than imaginary ones. "We got so caught up in keeping people out that we forgot to take care of each other," she said at a community gathering, her voice soft but resolute. Residents started talking again, sharing stories over coffee, rebuilding the sense of community that had been lost to paranoia. The gates remained, but they were symbolic now, open more often than not, a reminder of what had been and what could be. Meredith returned to work a month after the trial, her arm still sore, but her spirit unbroken. The local EMS department honored her with an award for courage, recognizing the injustice she'd faced. She accepted it on behalf of all first responders, her voice steady as she spoke to the crowd. "We risk our lives every day to save strangers," she said. "We shouldn't have to fight bureaucracy to do it." The memory of the taser still haunted her, but she channeled it into her work, determined to never let fear stop her. She and Kyle became closer after the ordeal, their partnership strengthened by the shared trauma. "We've got each other's backs," Kyle said one day, as they loaded their gear into the ambulance. Always. Gary Williams found himself at the center of a media storm, with requests for interviews pouring in from talk shows and podcasts. He wasn't interested in fame. His only goal was to honor Jeanette's memory. He donated a large portion of the settlement to a scholarship fund for aspiring paramedics, naming it after his wife. Jeanette was a nurturer, he said in an interview, his voice thick with emotion. She'd want this, helping people who save lives. He kept a small photo of her in his wallet, pulling it out whenever the grief felt too heavy. "Don't let rules get in the way of common sense," he told every reporter who asked. "That's all I want people to take from this." The lawsuit became a catalyst for broader change, not just in Orchard Pine, but across the country. Other HOAs began reviewing their own security policies, prompted by the national attention the case received. News outlets ran stories about the dangers of overzealous HOAs, and lawmakers in several states proposed bills to ensure emergency services could access gated communities without delay. The phrase "justice for Jeanette" became a rallying cry for advocates pushing for reform, a reminder of what happens when fear overshadows empathy. Back in Orchard Pine, the community slowly healed. Neighbors who'd once been content to let the board handle everything now took an active role, attending meetings, voicing their concerns, and rebuilding trust. The picket signs came down, replaced by flower beds and American flags. Elderly residents, many of whom had been shaken by Jeanette's death, found a renewed purpose in making sure it never happened again. "We're a community, not a fortress," Tom said at a block party, raising a glass of lemonade. "Let's keep it that way." For Gary, the healing was slower. He'd lost the love of his life, and no amount of justice could fill that void. But he found solace in small things. The scholarship fund, the community's transformation, the knowledge that Jeanette's death had saved others. He kept her wedding photo on the mantle, a reminder of their 50 years together. The travels, the grandchildren, the quiet moments on the porch. "I miss you every day," he whispered to the photo one evening, his voice soft. "But I'm making sure your story matters." Orchard Pine Estates would never be the same, but from the ashes of tragedy came a new beginning. The gates were still there, but the cracks in their foundation were visible, symbolic scars of a lesson learned the hard way. Safety measures without humanity can be deadly, but compassion and common sense can rebuild what fear destroys. Jeanette's death was a heartbreaking reminder of that truth, and her legacy became a beacon for a community determined to do better. Jeanette Williams should still be here, enjoying her retirement with her husband Gary. Instead, she's gone, because an HOA guard tasered a paramedic for trespassing, and a board's obsession with rules cost a life. But from this tragedy came change, a community that learned to put people over protocol, and a movement to make sure no other paramedic faces a taser instead of a patient. This is HOA Karen Files, where we tell the stories that need to be heard. Have you dealt with an HOA that went too far? Share it in the comments. I read every one. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next story. We'll see you soon. And let's hope the next community learns this lesson without losing someone they love.